Hands behind your head now." The sharp command cut through the night air, as Officer Derek Morrison flashed his beam directly into the young black man's face, crouched beside the evidence markers. "Step away from the crime scene and get on the ground immediately." FBI agent Marcus Williams looked up from the drug samples he was analyzing, genuinely surprised to find two patrol officers treating him like a suspect at his own federal investigation. "Officer, I'm a federal agent," Marcus said respectfully, though his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of crime scenes. "I'll decide what you are," Morrison snapped, his hand resting on his weapon as he studied Marcus with obvious suspicion. But what Officer Morrison didn't know was that he had just confronted a federal agent who outranked every cop in the city, and in exactly 10 minutes, his badge was about to become worthless. The abandoned warehouse district had always been Officer Derek Morrison's territory. At 31, he'd spent 7 years working the night shift in downtown Detroit, and he'd developed an eye for what he called criminal activity. Tonight, like most nights, he and his partner Jake Stevens were patrolling the industrial area when they received a call about suspicious activity near the old Morrison Steel building. Morrison had built his reputation on drug arrests in this exact neighborhood. He knew the patterns, understood the players, and had learned to trust his instincts about who belonged where and why. When the dispatch came through at 11:43 p.m. about someone tampering with evidence at a crime scene, both officers knew exactly what they were dealing with. Drug dealers often returned to scenes to retrieve stashed narcotics or eliminate evidence that could connect them to larger operations. FBI agent Marcus Williams had been conducting surveillance on the Morrison Steel warehouse for 3 months as part of Operation Steel Trap, a multi-state investigation into a drug trafficking network that moved millions of dollars in narcotics through Detroit's industrial corridor. At 33, Marcus was a 12-year veteran of federal law enforcement with specialized training in narcotic investigations and organized crime. Tonight's operation was the culmination of months of careful planning. Marcus had been working with Detroit police leadership to coordinate what would become the largest drug bust in the city's history. But that coordination apparently hadn't reached the patrol level, where officers Morrison and Stevens operated with their own assumptions about who had legitimate business in abandoned warehouses at midnight. Marcus had arrived at the warehouse at 11:30 p.m. to collect final evidence samples before tomorrow's coordinated raids. His unmarked vehicle was parked 2 blocks away, his federal credentials were in his jacket pocket, and his service weapon was holstered beneath his casual clothing that allowed him to blend into the industrial environment without attracting attention from the criminal organization he'd been tracking. The drug samples he was analyzing represented the final piece of evidence needed to secure federal indictments against 17 defendants across 4 states. Each vial contained narcotics that could be traced back to specific suppliers, distributors, and street-level dealers who thought their operation was invisible to law enforcement scrutiny. Officer Morrison approached the warehouse with his partner, both men moving with the practiced confidence of cops who had done this hundreds of times before. The abandoned building was dark, except for a single flashlight beam moving methodically through what appeared to be an evidence collection process. "Looks like someone's trying to clean up," Stevens whispered, as they positioned themselves outside the building's main entrance. "Probably came back for the stash we missed during the last sweep." Morrison nodded, his hand already moving toward his service weapon. In his experience, people who returned to crime scenes at midnight weren't conducting legitimate business. They were criminals trying to cover their tracks, eliminate evidence, or retrieve contraband that could incriminate them in ongoing investigation. The officers entered the warehouse with their weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved toward the figure crouched near what appeared to be organized evidence markers. The scene looked professional, almost like a police investigation, but Morrison had learned not to trust appearances in this neighborhood. "Police, don't move," Morrison shouted, his beam illuminating Marcus Williams in the middle of what was clearly a methodical evidence collection process. "Put your hands where I can see them and step away from whatever you're tampering with." Marcus straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening as he processed the situation developing around him. He recognized the tactical positioning, understood the officer's heightened alert status, and realized that his federal investigation had just been interrupted by patrol officers who had no idea what they were walking into. "Officers," Marcus said calmly, keeping his hands visible as he addressed the two men who had their weapons trained on him. "I'm FBI agent Marcus Williams. I'm conducting a federal investigation at this location, and I need to show you my credentials." Morrison's response was immediate and harsh. "Sure you are. And I'm the police commissioner. Keep your hands where I can see them and don't try to reach for anything that might look like a weapon or fake identification." The accusation of fake identification hit Marcus with familiar force. He'd heard similar dismissals throughout his career, moments when his professional authority was questioned, not because of any evidence of wrongdoing, but because assumptions about his appearance overrode common sense and procedure. "Officer Morrison," Marcus said, reading the name tag visible in the flashlight beam, "I understand your caution, but I am a federal agent and these are legitimate credentials. I'm asking you to verify my identity through proper channels before this situation escalates further." Stevens moved to a flanking position, his training kicking in as he secured what appeared to be a suspect who was attempting to talk his way out of a legitimate arrest. "Man, just cooperate and we'll sort this out at the station. Right now you're tampering with evidence at a crime scene, and that's a felony regardless of what story you're trying to tell us." Marcus felt the weight of the situation settling around him. Two patrol officers, operating with incomplete information and obvious bias, were treating a federal crime scene as their own jurisdiction and dismissing his legitimate authority as some kind of elaborate deception. "Before you make any arrests," Marcus said, his voice remaining steady despite the escalating tension, "I need you to contact your dispatcher and verify that there's an active federal investigation at this location. Operation Steel Trap, coordinated with Detroit police leadership through Deputy Chief Catherine Martinez." Morrison paused, the specific details giving him momentary doubt about his assessment of the situation. Drug dealers didn't typically reference police leadership by name or cite specific operation codes, but his instincts told him this was exactly the kind of sophisticated deception that career criminals use to avoid arrest. "Nice try," Morrison said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Career criminals always have elaborate stories about why they're not really criminals. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." As Morrison reached for his handcuffs, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "Officer, before you arrest a federal agent, I strongly suggest you make one phone call to verify my identity. Special Agent in Charge Jennifer Martinez, Detroit FBI Field Office. The number is in your department's Federal Liaison Directory." The specificity of Marcus's claim gave Stevens pause. In 7 years of patrol work, he'd never encountered a suspect who provided such detailed information about federal law enforcement structure. Career criminals usually made vague claims about knowing important people, but they rarely cited specific names, titles, and operational procedures. "Go ahead and make your call," Morrison said, though his confidence was beginning to waver. "When it doesn't check out, we'll add lying to a federal officer to your charges." Marcus pulled out his phone with slow, deliberate movements that wouldn't be interpreted as threatening. He dialed a number from memory, the call connecting on the second ring despite the late hour. "Martinez, this is Agent Williams. I'm being detained by Detroit patrol officers at the Steel Trap location. I need you to verify my identity and operational authority to Officers Morrison and Stevens." The voice that answered was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to handling federal law enforcement coordination at all hours of the day and night. "Put one of the officers on the phone," came the immediate response. Marcus extended his phone toward Morrison. "Special Agent in Charge Martinez would like to speak with you." Morrison took the phone reluctantly, his confidence beginning to erode as the reality of the situation started to sink in. This wasn't how drug dealers typically handled arrest situations. They didn't calmly make phone calls to people who answered with federal law enforcement protocol. "This is Officer Morrison," he said into the phone. "Officer Morrison, you are currently detaining one of my agents during an active federal investigation. Agent Williams is conducting authorized evidence collection as part of Operation Steel Trap, which your department has been cooperating with for the past 3 months. Rehook." But what Special Agent Martinez said next would not only end Morrison's career, but trigger the largest federal civil rights investigation in Detroit Police Department history. Agent Williams has been working undercover in your jurisdiction with full departmental cooperation, Martinez continued, her voice carrying an edge that suggested she was not pleased with the situation. He is a 12-year veteran of federal law enforcement with commendations from the DEA, FBI, and ATF. Every action he has taken tonight is authorized, documented, and coordinated with your deputy chief. Morrison felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. He wasn't just detaining an innocent citizen. He was interfering with a federal investigation and detaining a federal agent based on assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence or proper procedure. Ma'am, his identification looked suspicious, Morrison stammered, though he knew the explanation was inadequate. Young guy, alone at a crime scene at midnight. It seemed like someone trying to tamper with evidence. Officer Morrison, Martinez interrupted, her tone becoming sharper. Agent Williams is conducting legitimate federal business at a crime scene that has been under federal jurisdiction for 3 months. Your assumption that he was tampering with evidence was based on what, exactly? The question hung in the night air like an indictment. Morrison couldn't answer honestly because the truth was too ugly to admit. He'd assumed Marcus was a criminal because he was a young black man in an area where Morrison expected to find drug dealers, not federal agents. Martinez continued, "This conversation is being recorded and will be forwarded to your chief of police, the mayor's office, and the Federal Oversight Committee that monitors police-federal cooperation. Agent Williams will be released immediately, and a full report of this incident will be filed with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." Morrison handed the phone back to Marcus, his hands shaking as the full implications of his mistake became clear. This wasn't just a wrongful detention. This was a federal incident involving racial profiling, interference with a federal investigation, and the detention of a federal agent. Stephen stood in stunned silence, understanding that their routine patrol had just become a career-ending catastrophe. The specific details, the federal oversight, the civil rights implications, everything about this situation was escalating far beyond anything they could control or contain. Marcus ended the call and looked at both officers with an expression that was no longer patient or accommodating. "Officers, I need you to understand what just happened here. You detained a federal agent conducting authorized law enforcement activities because you made assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence or proper procedure." "Agent Williams," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we thought you were interfering with our crime scene." "Your crime scene," Marcus replied, his voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "This warehouse has been under federal surveillance for 3 months. Every piece of evidence you see has been catalogued and analyzed as part of a federal investigation that your department has been cooperating with through official channels." He gestured to the organized evidence markers, the methodical collection process, the professional documentation that should have been obvious to any experienced officer. "Does this look like someone tampering with evidence? Or does it look like a law enforcement professional conducting authorized investigative activities?" Stevens found his voice. "Sir, we responded to a call about suspicious activity. We didn't know about any federal investigation." "The lack of communication within your department doesn't justify what happened here," Marcus replied. "I identified myself as a federal agent, provided specific operational details, and requested that you verify my credentials through proper channels. Instead, you dismissed my authority and prepared to arrest me based on assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence." Morrison stood in silence, beginning to understand that his career in law enforcement was likely over. Federal agents didn't forget incidents like this, and the recording of his conversation with Special Agent Martinez would be reviewed by every level of police and federal leadership. The sound of approaching vehicles filled the night air as federal backup units responded to Martinez's alert. Unmarked cars and FBI tactical vehicles surrounded the warehouse, their occupants stepping out to secure what had become a federal crime scene complicated by local police interference. Special Agent in charge Jennifer Martinez arrived within minutes, followed by 2 FBI supervisors and a federal prosecutor who would need to assess whether the evening's events had compromised months of investigative work. Martinez approached Marcus first. "Agent Williams, are you injured or compromised?" "No, ma'am. But the entire interaction was concerning, and I believe it represents broader issues that need to be addressed. Martinez turned to Morrison and Stevens with the cold expression of someone who had dealt with police misconduct cases throughout her career. Officers, this scene is now under exclusive federal jurisdiction. Your interference with Agent Williams has potentially compromised an ongoing federal investigation. Morrison attempted to maintain some dignity. Special Agent Martinez, we were responding to a legitimate call about suspicious activity. We followed standard procedure for securing a potential crime scene. Standard procedure? Martinez replied. Your standard procedure includes ignoring federal identification, dismissing agent credentials as fake, and preparing to arrest someone conducting authorized law enforcement activity. She gestured toward the evidence collection setup, the professional documentation, the obvious signs of legitimate investigative work. Does any of this look like criminal activity to you, or does it look like the kind of methodical evidence collection that law enforcement professionals conduct at crime scenes? Stevens stepped forward. Ma'am, we made an error in judgment. We're prepared to cooperate with any investigation and ensure this doesn't happen again. This isn't about cooperation, Martinez said. This is about federal law enforcement officers being detained by local police who made assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. Agent Williams identified himself, provided operational details, and requested verification through proper channels. Your response was to dismiss his credentials and prepare for arrest. One of the FBI supervisors approached with a tablet displaying the preliminary report. Ma'am, this incident fits a pattern. Agent Williams has been questioned by local law enforcement 17 times in the past 5 years, while conducting authorized federal operations. 15 of those encounters involved no actual policy violations or procedural errors. The statistic hit Morrison like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor communication. It was part of a pattern where a decorated federal agent was routinely treated with suspicion despite his credentials, authority, and legitimate law enforcement activities. Martinez reviewed the data. Agent Williams, how many of those 17 encounters resulted in local officers verifying your federal status before questioning your authority? 3. Marcus replied. The other 14 involved officers who made immediate assumptions about my legitimacy based on my appearance rather than my credentials or activities. The federal prosecutor stepped forward. This pattern suggests systematic issues that go beyond individual officer judgment. We'll need to review all 17 incidents to determine whether civil rights violations occurred and whether federal intervention is warranted. Morrison felt his world collapsing. What had started as a routine suspicious activity call was now being analyzed as part of a federal civil rights investigation that could destroy not just his career, but potentially expose widespread problems within his department. Officers Morrison and Stevens, Martinez announced, you will remain at this location while federal investigators document this incident. Your weapons, badges, and identification will be secured, pending investigation by the FBI Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice. The warehouse that had been Morrison's territory was now a federal crime scene where his authority meant nothing. The drug investigation that Marcus had been conducting proceeded with professional efficiency, while local police officers stood on the sidelines watching their careers disintegrate. By morning, the story had reached local media outlets, accompanied by body camera footage that showed the entire encounter from initial contact to federal intervention. The video went viral within hours, with millions of viewers watching Detroit police officers attempt to arrest a federal agent based purely on racial assumptions. Morrison and Stevens were suspended pending federal investigation, their cases eventually prosecuted by the same Department of Justice Civil Rights Division that had been monitoring police misconduct tactics across the country. Both officers were convicted of civil rights violations and sentenced to federal prison, becoming examples of the consequences of racial profiling in law enforcement. Final rehook. But the real transformation came from what the incident revealed about the systemic challenges faced by black law enforcement officers, even those with federal authority and years of professional experience. For Marcus Williams, the incident represented both a personal victory and a sobering reminder that even a federal badge couldn't protect him from the assumptions that some officers made based on appearance rather than evidence. His experience became part of a federal training program designed to address bias in police federal cooperation. Operation Steel Trap proceeded successfully, resulting in the arrest of 17 defendants and the seizure of millions of dollars in narcotics. But the success was overshadowed by the recognition that effective law enforcement required not just good investigative work, but also the elimination of biases that could compromise officer safety and case integrity. The Detroit Police Department implemented new training protocols on federal cooperation, racial bias awareness, and proper verification procedures for law enforcement encounters. Morrison's body camera footage became part of police academies' curricula nationwide, showing officers the real consequences of making assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. 6 months later, Marcus was promoted to supervisory special agent and assigned to lead a new task force on police-federal relations, with special emphasis on addressing racial bias in law enforcement cooperation. His first initiative was a program designed to ensure that every federal agent's authority would be recognized and respected regardless of their race, age, or appearance. The warehouse district where Morrison had once patrolled became the site of a federal law enforcement training facility, where agents and officers learned to work together effectively while recognizing and addressing the unconscious biases that could compromise their missions and endanger their colleagues. Years later, when Marcus drove through downtown Detroit, he would pass the Morrison Steel warehouse and remember the night that changed everything, not just for 2 police officers who lost their careers, but for an entire system that had to confront the uncomfortable truth that bias could persist even among people sworn to uphold justice. Because sometimes the most important arrests happen not when handcuffs are applied, but when assumptions are challenged, biases are exposed, and people committed to justice decide that doing what's right matters more than protecting what's comfortable. The lesson of that night wasn't about federal authority or police procedure. It was about the courage to see people as they truly are, rather than as we assume them to be, and the understanding that real law enforcement requires officers who protect everyone's right, including the rights of their fellow officers, to be judged by their actions rather than their appearance.